never thought I'd end up here. Becoming a stepmom wasn't something I planned for my life, and I certainly didn't expect it to come with this kind of complication. When I married Brian, I knew it would be hard to navigate the new family dynamics, especially with his teenage son, Ethan. He had just lost his mom the year before, and the pain was still raw. Honestly, I didn't expect him to accept me right away, but I also didn't realize just how shut off he'd be. Ethan stayed holed up in his room most of the time, never really engaging with us. I felt like I was living in the same house as a stranger. I tried. I'd knock on his door and ask if he wanted anything, offer to bring him snacks, or ask him to join us for dinner. Every time I got the same answer, no thanks, or worse, silence. He wouldn't even look me in the eye. At first, I chalked it up to him grieving his mom. I thought maybe with time he'd warm up, but as the months passed, things didn't change. It hurt more than I wanted to admit. I was trying to create a family, to build something new with Brian, but with Ethan around, it felt like there was a giant wall between us. And as much as I told myself to be patient, it was hard not to feel like an outsider in my own home. Then one stormy night, everything changed. The rain was pounding against the windows, and a huge clap of thunder knocked the power out. The whole house went black. Sophie, my daughter from my previous marriage, started crying, terrified of the storm. I lit some candles and sat with her in the living room, trying to calm her down. I didn't expect to see Ethan, but then I heard footsteps in the hallway. "Ethan!" called out. To my surprise, he actually walked into the room. "Come sit with us," I offered, not expecting him to take me up on it, but he did. He sat down across from me and Sophie, his face softened by the flickering candlelight. For the first time, I saw him without that cold wall around him. He looked vulnerable. I started telling stories to distract Sophie from the storm. Funny little stories from when I was a kid, and to my surprise, Ethan laughed. A real genuine laugh. It was the first time I'd ever seen him smile like that. The night brought us closer. Over the next few weeks, Ethan started coming out of his shell more. He'd join us for dinner, sit with me in the kitchen while I cooked, and talk to me about school or life. It felt like I was finally breaking through to him, and it felt good. Maybe too good. I started noticing little things, like the way he'd look at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. His eyes lingered on me a little too long. His smiles came more often in our house. Brian worked long hours, often leaving me and Ethan home alone together in the evenings. It was awkward trying to act normal when everything between us felt so charged. I didn't know what to do or how to stop it. One afternoon, Ethan asked me if I wanted to go for a walk. I hesitated but figured some fresh air would do us both good. We walked through the park near our house, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows on the ground. It was quiet, peaceful, but the silence between us was loud. What if we're the only ones who can help each other move on? I could barely breathe. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that this was crossing a line we could never uncross. But part of me didn't want to say no. I hated myself for it, but there it was. "We can't do this, Ethan. There's too much at stake," I said, my voice shaky. "Your dad." "Sophie." "I know," he said, his eyes searching mine. "But I don't want to lie to you about how I feel." The rest of the walk was in silence. I felt like I was on the edge of a cliff, unsure whether to step back or let myself fall. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. Ethan's words echoed in my head. What if we're the only ones who can help each other? How did I get to this point? How had we gotten so far from the boundaries I promised myself I'd uphold? I kept thinking about Brian. How he trusted me. How he had no idea what was happening right under his nose. And Sophie, my sweet girl who looked up to me. I knew this was a path I couldn't go down, no matter how much I felt drawn to it. But avoiding Ethan wasn't working either. The next morning, I woke up determined to put some distance between us. I needed to set things straight. After breakfast, I found Ethan in the kitchen, scrolling through his phone, a plate of toast in front of him. He glanced up at me as I entered the room, his eyes lingering on me like they always did now. I could feel the tension immediately, like a thread pulling tighter between us. "Ethan, we need to talk," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He set his phone down and looked at me, his expression serious. "Okay," he said, as if he'd been waiting for this. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. Whatever's happening between us, it can't happen. We can't keep going down this road. His brow furrowed, and he stood up, closing the distance between us in a few steps. But I don't understand. Why are we pretending this isn't real? I know you feel it too. I do, I admitted, my heart sinking. But that's exactly why we need to stop. Ethan, I'm married to your dad. I'm your stepmom. We can't just act on these feelings. Ethan's face softened, and he reached out, taking my hand before I could stop him. But we're more than that. You know we are. I pulled my hand back, my stomach churning. No, Ethan. We have to stop. For your dad, for Sophie, for us. We can't destroy everything just because we're confused. The disappointment in his eyes cut through me, but I held my ground. He didn't say anything more, just nodded slowly, like he was trying to process it. I left the kitchen, hoping that conversation would be enough to put things back on track, to create the boundaries we desperately needed. But part of me knew it wouldn't be that easy. As the days passed, Ethan kept his distance. We still talked, but the tension between us felt even heavier now, like it was constantly lurking beneath the surface. I thought I'd done the right thing by having that conversation, but I couldn't shake the feeling that things weren't resolved. In fact, it felt like something was brewing, something I couldn't quite control. One evening, after Brian had left for a work trip, I was sitting on the couch with Sophie. She had fallen asleep while we were watching one of her favorite movies. I gently picked her up and carried her to her room, tucking her in and kissing her forehead before turning off the light. As I stepped out into the hallway, I saw Ethan standing there, leaning against the wall. My heart raced. I hadn't been alone in the house with him since our talk, and now with Brian gone, the tension felt even thicker. You okay? I asked, keeping my tone light, though inside I was anything but calm. I'm fine, he said, but there was something in his voice, something that made me feel uneasy. I started to walk past him, but as I did, he reached out and grabbed my arm, gently but firmly enough to stop me. Can we talk? I froze for a second, every part of me screaming that this was a bad idea. But instead of pulling away, I nodded. Okay. We moved into the living room, and I sat down, trying to keep some space between us. Ethan sat across from me, his eyes intense. For a long moment, neither of us said anything. The silence felt heavy, filled with all the things we hadn't said yet. I know you told me we can't do this, he finally said, his voice low, almost pleading. But I can't stop thinking about you. I can't pretend that this is just some weird phase I'm going through. I don't know what to do with these feelings. I felt a lump form in my throat, and I looked down at my hands, twisting them in my lap. Ethan, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to confuse you. But we can't. I can't. He leaned forward, his voice soft but insistent. Why not? Why can't we at least be honest about what's happening? I am being honest, I replied, my voice shaking. We're both vulnerable right now, and this is confusing. But I'm your stepmom. I love your dad. We can't betray him like this. Ethan stood up, pacing the room, running his hands through his hair. I don't know how to make this stop. I've tried to keep my distance, but it's not working. I need you. My heart pounded in my chest. The air between us felt suffocating. I stood up too, needing to put some distance between us. Ethan, ragged gasps. This can't happen. Ethan's face fell, his expression a mixture of hurt and frustration. But you didn't stop me, he said, his voice raw. You felt it, didn't you? I shook my head, trying to find the words, trying to make sense of the mess we had just created. That was a mistake, I said, my voice trembling. I shouldn't have let it get this far. Ethan, you have to understand, we can't do this. It's not right. He ran his hands through his hair, clearly torn between his feelings and the reality I was laying out before him. I know it's complicated, but I care about you, Clara. I care about you more than I should. I felt tears welling up, and I quickly wiped them away, desperate to hold it together. I care about you too, but not like this. Not like this, Ethan. I love your dad. This would destroy everything. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The weight of what had just happened hung in the air, thick and heavy. I couldn't believe how far things had spiraled out of control. I had let myself cross a line I swore I'd never cross, and now I had to live with the consequences. I'm sorry, Ethan said quietly, his voice cracking. I didn't mean to mess everything up. I nodded, swallowing hard. We both made mistakes. But we can't let this go any further. We need to stop now before we hurt anyone else. He nodded, but the pain in his eyes was unmistakable. I'll try, he whispered, his voice barely audible. Without another word, I turned and left the living room, my legs shaking as I climbed the stairs to my bedroom. I felt sick, like the weight of what had just happened was pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I collapsed onto the bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. How had I let things get so out of hand? As I lay there, the events of the past few weeks played over and over in my head. I kept thinking about Brian, how much he loved me, how much he trusted me. Guilt gnawed at my insides, twisting my stomach into knots. I had betrayed him in the worst way possible. And for what? For a moment of weakness? For a kiss I knew I should never have allowed? I barely slept that night, my mind too tangled with guilt and confusion to find any rest. When I finally dragged myself out of bed the next morning, I felt like a shadow of myself, hollow and numb. I avoided Ethan as much as possible, and to his credit, he kept his distance too. It was as if we both knew we had reached a point of no return and were desperately trying to claw our way back. A few days later, Brian came home from his work trip. The relief I felt when he walked through the door was almost overwhelming. I threw myself into his arms, holding him tight, trying to remind myself of everything I had to lose if I let this situation spiral any further. Miss me? He teased, kissing the top of my head. More than you know, I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. As the days went by, things seemed to settle into a strained but manageable routine. Ethan stayed out of the house more, spending time with friends or at the gym, and I threw myself into taking care of Sophie, trying to restore some sense of normalcy. But beneath the surface, everything felt different. I was constantly on edge, waiting for the other shoe to drop, and then one afternoon it did. I was cleaning up the kitchen when Brian walked in, his face pale, his eyes wide with disbelief. Clara, he said, his voice shaky. We need to talk. My heart stopped. I set down the dish I was holding, my hands trembling. What's wrong? He pulled out his phone, his fingers shaking as he tapped the screen. I found something, he said, holding out the phone to me. I took the phone from him, my stomach turning to ice. On the screen was a text message thread between Ethan and one of his friends. My heart raced as I read the messages, my eyes widening in horror. Ethan, I don't know what to do, man. I'm in love with her. Friend, dude, that's your stepmom. What the hell are you thinking? Ethan, I know, but I can't stop thinking about her. I kissed her last week. She didn't stop me. My world crumbled beneath me as I stared at the screen. My heart pounded in my chest, my hands shaking as I handed the phone back to Brian, unable to meet his eyes. How long? Brian asked, his voice hollow, broken. How long has this been going on? Tears welled up in my eyes and I shook my head, my voice barely above a whisper. Brian, I swear. It was just a kiss. It was a mistake. It never should have happened. He stared at me, disbelief and betrayal etched into every line of his face. How could you? How could you do this to me? To our family? I opened my mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. The weight of my guilt was crushing, suffocating. I wanted to explain, to make him understand, but I knew there was nothing I could say that would make this better. Brian shook his head, tears filling his eyes. I can't do this right now, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I need time to think. He turned and walked out the door, leaving me standing in the kitchen, my entire world collapsing around me. I sank to the floor, my body shaking with sobs. I had destroyed everything. Everything I had built with Brian, everything I had fought to protect, it was all gone. And I had no one to blame but myself.